Hades 2 is here, and overall, the game is excellent. For an early access title, the amount of content here is staggering and will keep players engaged for hours on end. My only issue is the boss fights, and in particular, the mobs that the bosses can summon. Here's the thing. I understand that because you are far more capable in this game than you are in Hades, the boss fights are going to be tweaked to match the player. I get that. I just think the inclusion of mobs with damn near every boss is a bit much and feels like a way to inflate the difficulty, which can take away the uniqueness of that boss. Even in the 3v1 against the Sirens, the final Siren can summon a mob, which to me makes no sense because the entire time I'm going to strategize to divide and conquer, and then at the end, they then get to summon a mob of enemies as kind of a last gasp. And to me, it's just a head-scratching decision. The thing is, I like all of these fights. I really do. I found all of them to be fun but fair, outside of maybe one. And we'll get to that. The Eris fight was probably one that I really enjoyed because it was a 1v1 for the most part. And what would happen is that as you went through the fight, her damage would scale. And I thought that was really cool because it kind of showed you how dire the situation would be. I thought Supergiant handled this well until you got to the end, in which, for no other reason than to make this fight more stressful, Eris can now summon elite mobs. This can be a pain to manage because her damage output at this point is in critical territory, and the mobs just aren't needed because one burst from her can kill you. Not only are you managing this, but the arena is burning down around you, and now there are elite harpies in the field. It just makes no sense. You already have this moment where the boss is clearly scaling as you're going through the fight, and then she hits that critical point in which everything is upped. Her aggressiveness, her speed, all that stuff. And you know that by this time that any mistake that you make is probably going to get you killed regardless of your build. If you want to make a boss memorable and threatening, let their skill sets and arenas do the talking. I appreciate the multiple phases by each boss, and I enjoy the fact that you can get into the back half of each of these fights. Most of these bosses are throwing multiple moves to throw you off. For the most part, it's all readable, and patient players won't have a problem making their way through multiple stages regardless of their build. The inclusion of mobs, though, can feel out of place because you effectively turn one-on-one encounters into a mess. This is especially egregious with the Kronos encounter. So leading up to this fight, you are made to believe through the various dialogue with all the different characters that Kronos is the threat of all threats. And because you have to fight through multiple stages to even get to him, that this fight was going to be epic and it was going to be challenging. If you happen to run into Hades prior to facing Kronos, one of the boons that you can receive will cut the numbers that are found in this fight in half. To me, that means we're already off to a bad start. If you didn't run into Hades, you are treated to a room filled with enemies, and you're going to have to not only manage them, but Kronos, whose damage output is higher than every boss in the game, and rightfully so. You wouldn't want the final boss to be a pushover. I feel like Kronos, on his own, would be formidable. In fact, if Supergiant just wants to speed him up a bit so that the weird delays between attacks don't exist, I would totally understand. He already has an incredibly high health pool, and the fact that he brings his shields up at different intervals during the fight to summon elite mobs makes this fight a mess to handle. Once he hits that second gear, Kronos is far more aggressive and starts to string together attacks in relatively quick succession. If you weren't used to these attacks by that time, you are more than likely already dead, and if the elite mobs are around, you're probably dinking and dunking all the while Kronos is in hot pursuit. If you don't have the optimal build as it relates to overall damage output, that first phase can feel like a lifetime. The mobs that get summoned at odd intervals feels unnecessary given how strong Kronos is. By the time you reach the second phase, you're probably thinking to yourself, what's next? The answer? More mobs and a far more dangerous boss who now has an insta-kill move. That move can be easily avoided, by the way, if you just move into the circle that glows within the time Kronos is charging up. If you were curious as to why you were dying instantly when you first entered that phase, well, there you go. In addition to the new insta-kill move, he can now fill the room with these stasis domes that will stop you in your tracks. He can also summon clock hands that move in the background, and this requires the player to be extra attentive during the confrontation, otherwise you're going to take big damage. This is a fight that requires the player to be aggressive with their opportunities because you will be wiped quickly if you don't take advantage of openings when they present themselves. And when you are in this fight, you seriously need to be aggressive, otherwise you are going to struggle. This second phase by itself is already difficult to manage for the player. Kronos is far more threatening here than he ever was in his first phase, and in my opinion, the second phase of the fight has an epic look and feel. But imagine my surprise and annoyance that in this phase, in which there's already a lot to deal with, he can summon mobs. And it's not just any mob either. He summons sand timers, which is the icing on the cake, because not only can they launch small orbs that can further clutter the screen and do pretty good damage upon contact, but upon death, they explode and they leave their own stasis fields. Kronos already has this ability, and it's annoying to deal with by itself. Adding these enemies that can do this upon death feels excessive. If you happen to get caught up in one of these stasis fields during the second phase, you can pretty much consider your run on life support. If you happen to get caught up in one of these stasis fields when Kronos is priming his insta-kill ability, consider your run over. And you're probably pissed because the fight is not clean in the slightest. One move is pretty much all it takes to end a run, and while I understand the need for the final boss fight to be epic and challenging, doing so in this manner is frustrating. It is one of the strangest decisions by Supergiant to make the final boss fight include this many summonable mobs, and it is on the normal difficulty. I just found that to be kind of weird. Because Hades 2 is fantastic by itself, you can create a fairly lengthy list of all the things that Supergiant has done right to help make this game feel like a worthy successor. Just to name a few, they doubled the bosses, gave you a new biome to explore. That biome, by the way, is structured differently than Tartarus. You also have new weapons, new abilities. You are so much more capable in this game than the first one, and there are just so many different things to praise about Hades 2 that it almost feels wrong to criticize the boss fights. But the more I play, and the more I try to complete runs with different weapons and different fear levels, the more I notice that the boss fights are the one thing that kind of stand out negatively. Why is Cerberus stopping all of a sudden during the fight to summon elite mobs? I mean, he's a hellhound who is incredibly powerful, and that fight by itself is really fun with all the different AoE attacks that you need to be cognizant of. Did he just get tired all of a sudden and need a break before reaching that critical state? It just doesn't make sense, and it interrupts the flow of the fight. The inclusion of an elite mob before the next phase just elongates the fight for no reason, and depending on the enemy summoned, it can lead to some really cheap damage, which can be frustrating. Personally, I have never liked the inclusion of mobs in any boss fight. I've always felt like they weren't handled properly and can ultimately cheapen the experience. This is especially true in roguelikes because you're already operating with a razor-thin margin, and I'm hoping that as Hades 2 continues in development, that the mob summoning mechanic for these bosses goes away or is at least limited to certain bosses. Also, make it make sense for the boss. And what I'm saying is, if I'm fighting something large and threatening like the Cyclops or the Cerberus, why do they have to summon mobs in the first place? They're already threatening. They already have devastating attacks. These characters take up a substantial part of the screen. There's no reason for them to stop and summon mobs for the players to contend with while trying to dodge AoE attacks. It just feels out of place. It's one of those things that, for the life of me, I just don't understand. These enemies are massive, and they're already doing fairly speedy attacks at times. Like when they get to that critical state, every boss speeds up, and they are throwing multiple AoE attacks at you. And not only are you dodging that, but you're dodging these elite mobs who are throwing barrels that explode at you. Like, let's not cheapen the experience here. Let's make the boss fights balanced. Let's make them fun. I think there's a part of that Supergiant is just kind of missing right now. Kronos and Eris are the two fights as of right now, because they're at the end, where there should be no mobs. While it does make sense for Kronos' character, he is a cunning individual and an overall smug asshole, the game makes it clear from the start that they are far more capable and threatening than any boss in the game. Both of them have high damaging AoE attacks, they have status effect abilities, and they have arenas that shrink as the fight goes along. You are in danger the moment you enter the arena. And the thing is, the moment that these two bosses reach their critical state, players know that they're in for one hell of an ending. The encounters already feature high tension. I do not need the inclusion of mobs to make the arena less readable. The second phase of the Kronos fight is one that definitely does not need mobs in the slightest. He practically doubles his abilities, and on top of that, he uses the arena against you. As capable as you are, he's practically the one boss that can really match you. He doesn't stay staggered for long, and any debuffs you hit him with do little to slow him down. It's clear that Supergiant created Kronos with the intent to challenge the player. Having this character summon mobs in both phases creates a really unbalanced fight. If they want to add to his toolkit, by all means do so. But the player should not have to sift through a whole bunch of bullshit to finish the fight, especially on normal. I get it if you want to do that when it's like adding another fear level, but when it's on normal, the fight is hard enough as it is. While the original Hades was limited in regard to the total number of boss fights, I felt like there was balance there, and bosses felt like they had pretty solid combo strings. When I got to Hades 2, I expected more of the same. I also knew that there were going to be curveballs thrown at the player. I just didn't think that practically every boss would summon mobs. Now, while it fits the narrative for some, it doesn't do that for all of them. It feels like a strange design choice, and maybe, just maybe it's a placeholder, but it's definitely the only aspect of the game, at least for me, that I feel is a bit of a letdown. With every other boss in Hades 2, I think the player is more than capable of handling them even with the added enemies. But as soon as you continue to progress through your runs, I feel like summoning mobs becomes an overused mechanic. It's like something they had to rely on to ensure that there was challenge with these boss fights. And it really becomes frustrating when you get to Kronos. With him, I expected tricks in multiple phases. I expected unique attacks and combo strings, and maybe some jank thrown in there for fun because the game still is in early access, but having the boss just summon mobs is a strange design choice. Knowing that, one, the character is fast, has multiple AoE attacks, can stop time, and when you hit that second phase, it's like a completely new fight. Everything is in overdrive with him. Having him summon sand timers that can stop you in your tracks feels cheap, and honestly, it just feels unnecessary. Now, maybe I'm overthinking this, but it is the one issue that I have with Hades 2 at the moment, because otherwise, this is a fantastic follow-up, and it is a game I'm looking forward to seeing grow. I'm just hoping that as we progress to the full release, that the bosses get tweaked, and we have fights that are not overly reliant on mobs. Maybe that's just wishful thinking. But that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.
Hated children such as you.